Historic Site, the American Bell Telephone Archives, the Bell Room of the National Geographic Society, the Tainter Papers at the National Museum of History and Technology, the Library of Congress, the New York Public Library, National Archives, and its various facilities, including the Federal Records Center at Suitland, Maryland. He wrote for Record Research, beginning with their first issue in 1955. He was a charter member of ARSC, and in 1968 ran for president with Phil Miller on the organization's first ballot. And at one time, he tried to get his PhD in 1975. His dissertation was to be on a full-scale history of the phonograph business. Unfortunately, he never completed his dissertation, but what did result is a series of scholarly articles for the ARSC Journal, beginning in 1976, beginning with the rise and fall of the Edison Speaking Phonograph Company, 1877 to 1880. This would become known, that article and several others would become known as chapters, as he called them, of the phonograph history, in which he hoped to someday compile into the book. But he never did publish the book, but these fundamental articles are accessible in the members section of the ARSC website. And he received an ARSC Lifetime Achievement Award in 1993, and Ray passed away July 18th, 2016 at age 93. And of course, I include some of his books, beginning with Edison disc recordings in 1978. He contributed to Record Research and some introductions to the other books. And his last book came out in 2008, and that was his last publication overall, and it was the Edison discography from 1926 to 1929. I want to go a little bit on a personal note now. I actually did know Ray. I met Ray only once, but we had corresponded for many years. I met him in 2011. I visited his home in Flushing because I knew he had documents there that were inaccessible at the Edison site, and I wanted to take a look at them. I asked him personally what he wanted to do, or eventually what would become of these documents. And he said, well, the Edison site was welcome to take whatever they would like that they didn't have. But when he passed away in 2016, I wrote to his household. I offered my condolences, and I introduced who I was, and I was interested in his papers. And if he wasn't interested, well, I was, or at least I would like to know where they would go. And his son wrote back to me and said, well, it depends on what's in his will. So when they went into his will, they had discovered that he actually did not will where his papers would go. So what we decided to do was, we came up with a plan, and what we decided was, and we went into a little bit of agreement on what we should do with his papers. So one thing he would like to do is his writings he would like Ray's writings to be in the public domain. The documents themselves would be scanned and made available to the public. When Ray was living, he was very generous in letting people not only use his research, but also when we were corresponding by email, he offered me to come to his house several times, even though I lived several miles away. So it would be scanned and made available to the public, that no one be denied access to the files. They were not to be sold or charged money to access, and eventually, as Ray had also wished, they would be donated to a library or an institution. So with that said, I look at you all and all his documents. Remember, he copied almost every page, from Edison to New York Public Library to the Federal Records Center and its various facilities. One of the most valuable and most interesting of all, I divide them all into sections. There are different sections of how he arranged his files. These are the legal files, and they are some of the most valuable reference materials that he had. He went to various archives, including the Federal Records Center in Suitland, Maryland, and their regional facilities, including in Chicago, in New Jersey, and also in Massachusetts. And he copied almost every page of a court case. This is what a lot of court cases looked like when I had received them. were bound together. Now, in order to scan them and apply OCR to them so they can be searchable, I had to unbind them, and some of them didn't even have markings on them. So they were given new folders, and I had to scan them I had to unbind them in order to scan them and have them correctly labeled. And I personally used a Canon R40 scanner, which has an automatic feeder to have them go through. But for larger and more fragile materials, I have a large plus-text scanner to have those. OCR was applied to them, and they were made searchable. Here's one of the results. So this is an interesting case. This is a court case involving Victor Herbert. His signature is right there, and Zonophone. There's a little bit of a Pittsburgh-related story to this. At the time that this lawsuit occurred, which was about 1902, Victor Herbert was conducting for the Pittsburgh Symphony Orchestra. And then someone came up to him and showed him a copy of a record. It was a Zonophone record, and it said Victor Herbert's band on it. And he insisted that it had nothing to do with him. And so he sued Zonophone over the use of his name, and he also mentioned that he didn't like the recordings at all that were on it. So Victor Herbert eventually won the case, but you can see an example of how the new scans have been coming out. I purchased new folders, all new folders, and all new envelopes to hold them. There's nothing really, I didn't really go all out and buy anything that was really significant for the folders. I just used temporary folders so that whoever, for the archivist who would eventually get to these, they could use their own folders for whatever they see as necessary. So they're actually just temporary folders, but these are the finished results. And those are the legal files right there. Now it turned out after I took this, I've discovered 3 more boxes of legal files, so there's going to be more added to this, but this is what the finished product looks like, and it's all set and ready to be donated. My intention is to donate them to the Edison National Historic Site. I got in touch with the archivist there, but it kind of depends on, because they're going through some renovations right now, especially regarding some of their archive, that some of it actually got damaged. So they're actually prioritizing that right now. So right now we're kind of still a little bit in limbo as to going there, and they also have to go through a committee as well. So the committee has to decide on whether or not they'll take it. So we're still in the very early stages of where they're eventually going to go. And next subject files. And he had these arranged by artists. A lot of them are by artists, but they go by different various companies. Some of them are also, some of them also include businessmen. So this is another section of his archive. For example, here's a picture of the Happiness Boys, Billy Jones and Ernie here. And we also gave them new folders as well, and they had a lot of them unmarked too. So I was able to mark them and label them. A lot of these art subject files also contain brief discographies, some of which Ray had never published. They are discographies of various artists, particularly the operatic artists. Like here's one of Ray's personal favorites, Marie Rappold. Ray published his Rappold discography in Hobbies magazines in the 1960s. But what's interesting about this is it also includes this little introduction that tells where Ray cites his sources as for putting it together. And this, as far as I can tell, was never published. It didn't appear in Hobbies when he printed his Rappold discography. And 2 more interesting files I'd like to know. are some of the audition files. These include 2 Brown Wax era artists, Edward M. Faber and Dan W. Quinn. Now, these were done later. This was after the Brown Wax era, and they are auditioned for the new Edison Diamond discs in the teens. During the teens, the typewritten part that you see on the top there was Edison's original comments that he wrote into his notebook. But what these files, what's interesting is they include follow-up comments, ones that you won't find in Edison's original notebooks. Like, for example, in Edward M. Faber's case, he just barely passed his audition, but it said that his voice was gone by the time they decided to start making records of him, and he had gone into the motion picture business, playing character roles. And in Dan W. Quinn's case, he passed his audition with flying colors, but they said they made samples of his song, but very samples of his songs, but they were rejected due to his nasal quality. So these are just some of the main treasures that you'll see in the subject files. And I just organized them. They're all organized right now, and they're going to go up on Internet Archive shortly, which I'll talk about in a little bit later. Now, one of the most challenging ones that I'm going to be faced with is the largest portion of the archive, and the one that's going to take the longest for me to digitize are the contents of his massive file cabinets. The papers were all arranged chronologically. These are the chronological files. This is a look at them on the left side before they were moved. The bulk of Ray's personal archive was arranged chronically, year by year. The majority of them date from the 1880s and the 1890s. And the very first document that I could trace, the very first one in the chronological files, was from Patrick Feaster's Phonozoic website, mentioning Leon Scott, the inventor of the phonograph. So that happened to be the very first document of the very first box. The latest one I could find was a New York Times article dating from September 7th, 1997, discussing about the idea of a mini DVD that contains surround sound. And the article says, a DVD offering surround sound with pictures could be more than just another medium in a series stretching back to Edison's cylinder. So that was the very last, that was the last one that I could find a date on. And there are some sound recordings involved. We discovered a few sound recordings of his lectures. These are, there's at least 3 of them. There's a 4th one that I'm trying to get a hold of. He did not have very many of them, but he did give some of his lectures at the Edison National Historic Site. I had just had them transferred, and I'll have them uploaded just shortly. It's not just the ARSC one that he presented back in the late 1970s. Some of them he actually gave on certain tone test performers, and also about various unissued Edison recordings that he also presented. So those will also be pretty unique once we get those uploaded. Microfilms. He had a set of microfilms he kept. They include the weekly reports of the recording division of Edison from the teens and 20s, the phonogram, which I believe is already digitized and already uploaded on Internet Archive, 2 early diamond disc ledgers, and the North American Phonograph Company bankruptcy papers. And it turns out that not even the Edison National Historic Site has copies of these microfilms. I would like to have them cleaned, and I will access a digital microfilm scanner and have them digitized and uploaded as well. I'm still on the lookout for a digital microfilm that's a little closer to where I live. There's one that I know of, but it's about an hour and a half away, but I will go there and have them digitized, and they will be accessible, and hopefully they will be back in the possession of the Edison National Historic Site once more. The last section of the archive that I'm planning to digitize is the correspondence. It kind of depends on who the author is. I may or may not publish some of them because it just depends on who the author is. If the person is still living and if it might be subject to copyright. Here's one example. It's from Brian Rust's initial correspondence from 1968. He was completing another edition of jazz records at the time, and he was also working on the American Dance Band discography, and this was his initial correspondence to him in 1968. He was referred to them by the Thomas Alva Edison Foundation in Detroit, and he wanted to know if he could supply about 30 dates or so for his discography that was coming out. I find that really, really fascinating. That's one of the most fascinating letters that I actually discovered in his files, his correspondence files. And here's another one from Eldridge Johnson's son, Fenimore. Eldridge Johnson founded the Victor Talking Machine Company, and this is another letter that he wrote to him saying that he was working on a full-scale history of the phonograph business. And it said that his papers pertaining to Eldridge Johnson and the phonograph business eventually went to the University of Wyoming, but he was able to get several photocopies from them. I've seen them in his files. Now, for the disposition, where the scans and where to host them all, I had chosen Internet Archive. And I'm going to have the link up there for the next couple of slides, so you'll be able to copy it when I change slides in the next few of them. So now that we have the scans, where should I host it? Well, I could build my own website, but if something were to happen to me, then where would it go? So I chose Internet Archive because it's publicly accessible and it probably is an entity that will still be around long after I'm gone. The public is free to use it, so we're going back to what we had agreed upon with his son as to making his files accessible. So the public is free to use it. It can be accessed anytime by anyone, anywhere. No one is denied access to it, and it comes at no charge. So if you need a copy, a link down, it will be on the next two slides, or you can just Google Raymond R. Wile Research Library. Now, I like to set goals for myself, and when I would like to get this completed is about 3 years from now, hopefully. It might be a little bit more, but what I plan to do is try to get the majority of the chronological files completed by 2026. It depends on how I can work around my regular job. But I also want to thank the following people: Tim Brooks, also David Giovanoni, Alan Sutton, and his son Jonathan Wile, for letting me do this work, and for their recommendation and their trust in me into getting this completed. So I thank them all, and hopefully we'll see you online soon for the Internet Archive. And I want to thank everybody here for coming. I really